Hello, and welcome to our webinar on collaborative planning with SAP IBP and SAP Analytics Cloud. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to this. And let me begin with a couple of quick introductions so you know who you're going to be seeing and what we're going to be talking about today. I'm Russell Sad. I'm the Practice Director for Planning, so the UK and Ireland, and this is all about planning in the SAP world. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background to why we at Westernacher think that we are good people to be explaining this to you today. We'll then drop into a little bit of theory just to walk you through what actually is going on, what's behind it, and what some of these tools are or processes. And then I'm going to be giving you a short demo. So this is actually something we put together on our own systems, which you could do yourselves to see how this would work in practice. So let me continue on now to give a little bit of the groundwork. So who are Westernacher? What are we going to be talking about today? So Westernacher Consulting isn't exactly a new consultancy. We've been around since 1969. So we actually founded 3 years before the SAP themselves. Although we might be a global company now of 1,100 consultants and counting, we're not quite the same scale as the SAP, but we are an SAP partner. We've been an SAP partner for 30 years, and this is our life as consultants. So we cover the entire digital supply chain. And this is something which we think makes us a little bit unique. We're big in logistics, we're big in planning, we're big in analytics, we're good in ERP, we know finance. So we cover the entire bandwidth. And that's going to be useful for us in a second, because we're talking about why it's important to bring these different areas together in planning, so that we're not doing silos where finance is a world of their own and supply chain happens to have nothing to do with finance and doesn't understand why it's important to them, and so on. Planning, to me, it's the entire supply chain. It's all of these different operations, and they become part of the whole. So if we're looking at what's collaborative planning, and that's the title of this presentation, what collaborative planning, so planning together for a company, is all about, well, let's walk through. So typically, the board of any company, so including our own board, will set out the strategy for the coming 5 or 10 years. And when the board is making decisions, they'll typically be looking at financial statements. Now, Westernacher is employee owned, and so we consultants are sort of the shareholders, so our board has to convince us that we are doing the right thing. But in a company which is on the market, then any decisions and strategy the company is taking will have to convince the shareholders, and people here look at financial statements. So at the end of the day, we're in the business, and we're looking at profitability. And we're going to be looking at that in financial projections. What will we achieve in 2 years' time if we do this? And who's involved in this? So now we're getting here to the second level. The board's set, where do we want to go? We want to achieve 3% growth. How are we going to handle this? And there's going to be targets now, which will break down to all the different departments. So, for example, the sales team. This is sales and revenue planning, where they're looking at the potential of the market. What can we generate? How can we work with our biggest customers, our key accounts? Do we need to introduce new products, or what's our pricing strategy going to be, because we've got inflation? We've also got then operations. So here we've got supply chain planning. Here it is, what do we need to produce? What's the most economic way to produce it? Because we live in a world of limitations, we might not be able to meet our demand. So how do we optimize what we're doing? We've also got human resources, because every company employs people. Do we have the right people? And of course, people will be being hired, they'll be leaving the company, they'll be promoted, they'll be moved to different departments, social security will change next year, salaries are adjusted, so all of that also plays in. And then finance themselves, we're looking very much on the budgeting, capital expense planning, operational expense planning, which is linked to budgeting. So looking at the headcount they need, which again links with HR, and producing these financial statements. So the budgets, projected profit and loss, looking at projected cash flows, the balance sheets, the investments. So all of this put together is the planning that a company needs to do. And it needs to be a collaboration because all of these departments will touch upon each other. And that's what we're going to be looking at, how it is actually technically possible within the SAP world, but also to make the case to you why you should be doing it. I'm going to be touching on two tools. Now, I'm assuming that in my audience, we've got people coming from different areas. So people who are now from the operations and supply chain planning world may be completely familiar with IBP and already heavy IBP users. So IBP is SAP's flagship cloud platform for all supply chain planning. So sales and operations planning is part of this, demand planning, supply and response, inventory optimization, and so on. This is the tool that we're used to using, that we look at the entire network, the digitalization of what the company actually does, how we produce, how we manufacture, who the customers are, what we need to produce, what quantities, what raw materials. This is our world. And so this is something where we're looking at this from an operations perspective. So when we're talking about demand, we're trying to work out what we're going to be selling to whom, how many units are going to be needed, what do we need to do to ship them to the right customers, so they've got to be in the right warehouses, how are we going to produce it, what do we need to buy in. That's what we're all about. And there's another side of this as well, because I'm also going to be talking about another major tool from the SAP, namely the Analytics Cloud. And so this is where you'll be doing your financial planning. So all of you who are coming in now from finance or controlling, this is likely your day-to-day tool. So you are quite familiar with this, and all this strange stuff about supply chain is sounding a little bit strange so far, but we'll get into that. So for all of those now from operations, the Analytics Cloud is SAP's cloud-based solution for all financial planning and all modern analytics. So if you're going to be doing your budgeting, if you're doing your costing, if you're creating trial financial statements, or even just doing the reporting on those, this is where you would be doing this. Okay, now you've met the tools. Let's jump into the theory. So why am I bringing these two areas together? And it's quite deliberate that there's two here. So financial planning and supply chain planning. Where do they touch on? So if we take a little look at what touch points we have, I want to convince you that this is actually legitimate. So here on the left, we're just taking a look at the financial planning world. So what are we talking here? We're talking about a profit and loss statement. We're talking about cost centers. We're talking about headcounts. We're talking, again, in this account view over time, we're talking about revenue, income streams. We're talking the cash flow it means. We're looking at, and again, the expenditures we've got to make. We've got to justify this. So this is traditional financial planning and reporting. And on the other side, we've got our world of supply chain planning, where we're looking at networks, where we're looking at how all the different nodes of an organization will have to fit together. How do we actually supply this customer demand? And so what does it mean? What needs to be produced, shipped, and what's it going to cost us as we're trying to work out how to balance then the potential demand and the supply, because we live in a world of constraints. These two areas are not separate. We might be looking on the one hand at volume, and we might be looking at the other hand purely on quantities, but these are integration points, and this is what I'm trying to show you here in the middle. So for example, if we're talking about demand in the supply chain world, this is actually potential revenue in the financial world. If we're optimizing the supply chain world, we're trying to do things in the most economic way. That's why we need visibility on prices and costs. Else, we can't decide, should I supply customer A or customer B? Is this particular product the one we've got the highest profitability, or is it negligible? What are the different costs involved? So this is something we need to understand. And again, if I'm going to be doing a trial financial statement, I'll need to know what my costs of production actually are. I mean, usually in the distant past, which I'm hoping is the distant past for you as well, we'd have said something like, we'll look at the average ratios between revenue and costs over the last 6 months, year, 3 years, and then we can say, okay, for every €1 million of revenue we get, we will have, on average, 30% direct costs. So this is what we're going to assume, which is a very high level assumption. What we should really be doing is doing this at base level, actually from the ground up, simulate the entire production chain and figure out what will they really be. And this is what IBP is actually doing on an absolute detailed level. That's the point. So that's very useful. Equally, and this is the mainstay of this presentation, for IBT, we might be looking at potential revenue and costs, but we can't work with actual ones, not current ones, not if we're looking at what are we going to achieve, how are we going to do it in the next 6 months to a year. So we're looking at what will prices and costs be then. And this is where it comes out of costing. So the financial and controlling world, where we're looking at activity costs and we're calculating them. And we can't do that unless we've got visibility on all of the different components. And this is happening in the financial world. So these are two areas which can really bring value to each other. So let me now walk you through this little example here. Now, I'm going to jump into the demo in a moment. This is just so you can understand what we're going to be looking at. I've chosen two personas here. So we're going to have Bob from operations, and I've got Amy from finance. So Bob and Amy are working for the same company. Bob knows IBP, so he's working in sales and operations planning. Amy is a financial analyst, and so she's mainly working in controlling. And so where are these interactions here between the two as they're working through the normal planning cycle? So we're just looking at a typical day's work between the two of them in the different departments on the different tools, and where are the touch points going to be? And bear in mind, I was saying that pricing and costing is, for us here, the most obvious thing to show you why it's important. This is a quick look at the world in which Amy is actually going to be. Now, I'm hoping this might be something that some of those of the audience who are already using Analytics Cloud will immediately be familiar with, because not only are these the typical areas of financial planning. So here at the top, obviously we might be arriving at our financial statements, but we've also got capital expense planning, we've got sales profitability planning, we generate and plan product costing, and we need to work on our operational expenses. So that's typical budgeting here. So all of these interact, and this is actually SAP's demo. It's called the Integrated Financial Planning for SAC. You can install it yourselves, take a look at it. It's intended to inspire you and show you how you can do full financial planning in the SAP world. So this is not completely ready to use. It's there to show you everything that's possible. And one of the areas I'm delighted to see is that the SAP took a big look at activity costing. So here, costing and pricing, this is what it's all about. And that's why you see that we've got touch points left and right to other areas as well as from down. So it integrates with S4. So your ERP system is the complete history of everything that's happened. And this is again the platform on which future plans will be put into effect. So we need to know, for example, what the activity costing should be for the future. This is how it's calculated. We've also got a connection to IBP, because here an obvious thing is if we're using IBP, then we're going to be doing our demand planning there. And for us to arrive at the consensus demand in IBP, this is the source of revenue, planned revenue at an extremely detailed level for us here in profitability planning. So if we plan a sales price, we'll have a sales quantity from IBP, and then we can start bringing this in to profitability planning for, again, showing in IBP, in the management review, what are we actually doing? Because if you're on the sales team, you'll see that in a second, you care about revenue as well as how many pieces. But let's now jump into this. This is actually from the Integrated Financial Planning demo content from the SAP. So all of you who are using the Analytics Cloud, you can install this and take it for a test drive yourself to see. SAP have included a complete walkthrough of how all of the different areas could hang together in a typical planning round. And this is what our persona, Amy from Finance, is going to be doing. So here Amy is looking at financial statement planning. Amy is going to be looking to see what the targets are that her boss has been setting. And she's now working out how we're going to achieve those. Amy is focusing here on pricing and costing. And this part of the content, the Analytics Cloud, the demo content, is there to walk people through to see how a typical day in the life can actually work out in practice. So again, you can install this yourselves. If you've got Analytics Cloud, take a look at it, takes it by the hand, walks you through to show you how this can look. And what Amy is doing here is she's looking at the finished goods, because we live in an era of rising costs, high inflation, potential tariffs coming from America. So what we need to do is to see what impact is this going to have if we take these into account. So Amy is running up a quick scenario here. We're going to work with a couple of different assumptions. So firstly, she understands that our direct material costs are going to rise. We've pushed our suppliers as hard as we can, but what if we're going to have to face 10% higher costs? Well, let's see what happens if we are going to raise our actual price of our products, so our selling price. And that's what she'll be adjusting in a second after she takes a look to see how is it currently looking in our profitability report. So this is planned. Amy's going through updating this, because if we're going to be changing prices, assuming we've still got the same quantities, we just need to recalculate here in the Analytics Cloud, then it just rolls it all up to give us the profitability. And the point of this particular view across the different components and modules within financial planning is that we can roll them up to see how it all works together in context. Because my total profitability, I will have income and costs from all sorts of different areas. And we're just looking at one very small part, direct sales revenue and direct material costs. Right. Now Amy is getting started because we're going to have to keep adjusting this. So she's looking to see again how things hang together. She also needs to just run a few actions here to recalculate gross margin. So this is all things which, again, if you've got the content, just walk through. It's set up to show you how you could be working in a typical planning round, maybe very similar to something you're already doing yourselves, maybe in a different tool, maybe in something you've also built in the Analytics Cloud. But if you're new to this and you're wondering, well, how will it work in practice? This is something which we'll show you. So let's continue as Amy makes her adjustments. Bear in mind that we are constantly jumping back to see what a trial financial statement would look like. And now let's jump to the other side. So this is Bob now from operations. He's logged into IBP. IBP can also be web-based. Here he's using the plugin for Excel because it's easier if you're doing mass changes. So he's looking at the statistical forecast. So the quantities which we're forecasting as we're arriving at our consensus demand. So what demand quantities are we expecting? And you may note, to actually understand these as potential revenue, we need prices. And the planned prices we're pulling in from the SAC. Now, let's see how we do that. So this is something, again, you can do yourselves by hand. IBP and SAC are both on the HANA Cloud. So if you've got accounts of both, it's relatively straightforward to actually transfer data between the two. And so this is us doing this by hand to actually say, I want to take this particular price from this particular model in the SAC, push it over to this planning area and this key figure in IBP. And if we're doing this properly, these are the sort of integration jobs that should be running maybe once per day, overnight, every hour. It's up to you. This would be something which just happens because it's been set up that way. But we wanted to make that point that this is actually doable, this is real, that it's not actually a big technical thing to transfer between the two. So these are completely different tools, these are completely different ways of modeling, but they can talk to each other. And so if I want to get new pricing into IBP, I don't just have to look at what I upload by Excel or I source from my S4. I can also have SAC give me the latest pricing. And as you see here, we're now seeing that Amy's adjustments, where she's raised the unit price from $15 to $15.75. And that is now starting to work its way through. So we can now see that if all remains the same, it's up to our revenue. Right. Well, that's the pricing side done. Bear in mind, I did say that Amy is still going to be working on the product costing side because we're doing this because we're expecting our raw material costs to rise by 10%. And Amy wants to simulate this. And so as you can see, Amy's jumped into her product costing application and she's increased raw material costs by 10%. So this is per unit. I mean, these are different cost components. So you see there's also a ground transportation bit, but we're not considering that. This is simply a change which is made. And Amy is now, again, just pushing this through because she wants to see what it's going to look like as an impact in profitability planning. To get to things like costs and pricing, obviously we can enter them in IBP, but from the operations side, we don't have the visibility or the context of what they should be and why. So Amy does because she's working on the actual budgeting. So she knows here how much an hour of machine time is actually going to have to cost her, or an hour of engineer time, or again, what the market situation is looking like or could look like, or what, again, the pressures from increased salaries might be. So she's got that visibility of what pricing would actually have to be. This is where costing and pricing is done for the future. So she's just updated this. And so rolling up, she's now got visibility on what the pricing are. So Bob recognizes that pricing has been updated, but not costing. And usually, as I said, in reality, this will all happen overnight or with a planned job. But we're just showing you this is how it's done. So again, the Analytics Cloud has got the ability to extract and load data between systems. And again, here we're doing a push into IBP. So our export job for these new material costs is now being made between the appropriate planning area in IBP from the appropriate planning model in SAC. And as you can see, Bob is now seeing that his baseline price is being updated for the planning period. This is a slightly older demo, so we're working with data from 24 was still our planning area, so that you can find this yourself in your own systems. We're working with that, even though it's 2025. But he's now seeing that this has come through. And so in IBP, in the demand planning and sales and operations views, we can now start talking about revenue and profitability because we've got this visibility. And what Bob could be doing is he could now be optimizing from a supply chain point of view how to best balance demand for particular customers and supply based on the new expected costs in this scenario that he and Amy are both cooking up together, because they're both working on what is the impact going to be of our raw material costs going up by 10% in this issue because % tariffs could happen. Bringing it together, we can now, if we're going to be working here with the sales team, be looking at what expected revenue will we have based on plan pricing, and how can we optimize our profitability based on this expected revenue and these expected costs. And this is important information for Bob to be able to be making the right decisions with his team, because without visibility into what expected future pricing and costs could be, we're working with what we know today. And it's not just having a knock-on effect in this particular area of sales revenue, because we might also be optimizing our stock levels. And if we're optimizing stock, how much should I actually hold? It's actually important for us to know, again, not just how much does it cost us to store it, but how valuable is it? There's a big difference between having components which cost $1,000 a piece and having components which cost $10 a piece. You obviously don't want a million of one if you don't need them. You've got to weigh this up and balance it. So again, we need this visibility for these future scenarios. And these future scenarios only make sense when you start putting them together. Oh, I did tell you, of course, that SAC can push and pull data from other systems. And here, we're actually updating now SAC from IBP, because Bob's been rebalancing. So with this extra visibility, we've now got better visibility on what quantities do we expect to sell. So what effectively for Amy now, back in the financial world, what this will mean for her expected revenues if this is going to happen, as well as the direct material costs, which will be associated with them because we've been able to do a simulated MRP run in the IBP. And so we know how many pieces of our raw materials we're going to have needed. So this brings it back. This is now updating Amy's view. So in profitability planning, she can now see it, the IBP updates which ricochet through. And as she's getting this ready, she's now jumping into the financial statement planning because she wants to see what the trial P&L for the coming year will actually look like with these new figures. So again, she's pulling these in now from the other areas. She's running data actions which do this for her in the SAC. So she's bringing out the gross margin. She could also be updating her operation expenses. Again, how you do these things depends on your tool and what you've built and what you're using. But this is simply how it would look if you're working within the demo content. And this is also why we're trying to focus on the demo content so that you can look at it yourselves. And that concludes our demo part. My point to you had been that even something as simple as pricing and costing, raw material costs, expected finished goods prices are not things that we know of in the IBP world because they're actually arrived at by a different team who've got the context and the visibility to be able to be planning them. But we need them in the IBP world because they give us, again, context which underlies the decisions that we will have to make. Similarly, things that we're doing in the IBP world, our entire network model of the organization, being able to balance supply and demand, this results in information which the financial planning controlling world desperately needs, because this gives them real bottom-up planned revenue, planned direct material costs, and something we didn't really look at, but for Amy to have been doing some of this costing, she would have needed to know information on the drivers of these activities, because in the supply chain planning world, we could tell Amy exactly how much for this particular scenario, how many labor hours we might need on these different work centers. How many machine hours is it going to be behind a particular production process for a particular line? And that helps Amy write off and cost, again, production in her world. And this is how she's able to arrive at the other parts of the cost structure, which we do not see. Otherwise, Amy doesn't have this context information, has to guess. Without Amy's data, in the IBP world, operations planning, we also have to make assumptions and guess. And so if you bring the two together, if both an Amy and a Bob are working hand in hand in their own world's own tools, but the tools are constantly talking to each other, updating each other with valuable information and context, then we're able to plan for the entire organization. And this is what collaborative planning is all about. And you will hear a lot about this from the SAP because it is incredibly valuable. We can do it technically, and you should be doing it functionally. On that note, thank you very much for your attention. If you've had any questions so far, please put them in the chat. We're still there. We're still there to answer them. And we're only too happy to answer any questions you might like to put to us afterwards. So you have my contact here. Please make use of it. Thank you.